Hey everyone, welcome to Ex-Fundie Diaries. My name is Elly, my pronouns are she, they, and this is another video about the Christian nationalist propaganda that I was raised with. In my last video about this topic, I gave a tour of my 8th grade science binder. This time, I'll be reading an anti-abortion paper that I wrote in 9th grade. But before I get to that, I want to give you a little bit of context for my childhood indoctrination regarding abortion. Like most evangelicals, fundamentalists, and conservatives, I was taught that abortion is an evil act of murder in every single scenario imaginable. And not only that, but it was portrayed to me as an urgent emergency that needed to be prioritized over all other political issues. My mom was so passionate about this that she had a case of silicone fetuses that she kept on the coffee table in the living room. Each one was a little larger than the last to show the progression of growth in the womb. When secular and liberal family members would come over to visit, she would open it and make them look at it. And it wasn't just my mom drilling these anti-abortion messages into me. I was completely surrounded by them in the 90s and early 2000s at both church and in Christian homeschooling. I actually had homeschool friends and acquaintances who would protest outside of Planned Parenthood clinics, offensive signs and all. I am so grateful that I was too afraid of such a confrontational interaction to participate in these protests. But I found other ways to participate in the fight for the unborn. I prayed to end abortion once and for all, and I parroted harmful anti-abortion rhetoric to anyone who would listen. After graduating from homeschooling, I started attending community college and I eventually got a job. And this was my first exposure to the world outside of the cult that I was raised in. Though I was still a fundamentalist in many ways, there were a few progressive views that began creeping into my subconscious. For example, one time while my dad was watching Bill O'Reilly, I informed him that I was a socialist. The little that I knew about socialism just seemed to make sense in relation to Jesus' teachings about caring for the poor, and even the way that the early Christians in Acts seemed to share and take care of each other. I can't remember my dad's exact response to this, but it's pretty safe to say that he was not happy. The first year that I was old enough to vote was 2012. I was newly married, and it was the first couple of months that I was out from underneath my dad's spiritual headship. Even though I was raised to grow up and become a devoted Republican, I really didn't feel tied to the Republican Party at that point. And since I knew that President Obama was a Christian, I really wanted to vote for him. And I thought about it for a long time, but what I could not get over was his support for reproductive rights. So I chose not to vote at all. I just couldn't bring myself to vote for someone who, at the time, I believed was promoting murder. The issue of abortion literally overrode everything else in my mind. Knowing what I know now about Christian nationalism, this makes perfect sense. My indoctrination worked exactly as it was supposed to, even after I began considering viewpoints beyond my upbringing. This single issue, opposing abortion, was enough to keep me from voting for President Obama, even though I wanted to. All of the devotion and passion and fervor that they instilled in me for this supposedly righteous issue kept me from voting against the interests of the white Christian patriarchy. That is the true purpose of the pro-life movement. They say it's about saving lives, but it's actually about power and control. Here is Dr. Anthea Butler, the author of the excellent book, White Evangelical Racism, explaining more.
one of the things I think is important for people to know at this particular junction in our nation's history is that evangelicals have always used morality to put forth issues that will allow them to have political power. And so if we look at abortion as being the sine qua non of all of these issues, you would miss the point, because the point has always been for them is that how do we get power? How do we assert ourselves in the nation's history based on our religious beliefs? And I think it's really important to understand that they don't necessarily see this First Amendment like we would. They see it as though a way that God has created the Constitution, and therefore God's law is over man's law. If we take a step back and begin to look at how these things come about, it's not just abortion, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about all of these things that they believe that are the biblical ways to be, as opposed to the laws of the land, then we get to see a different picture about what they are saying and what they are doing.
In my 8th grade science binder video, I said that I learned from Tori Williams Douglas' White Homework podcast that opposing abortion is inherently racist. In response, I have gotten quite a few comments taking issue with this. But I stand by that statement, and since then I have learned even more reasons why. I'll be putting a whole list of resources down below that I would definitely recommend checking out, but I'd also like to highlight a few details. Abortion bans negatively affect all people with a uterus, but they affect Black, Brown, and Indigenous people the most, because of systemic racism in healthcare, income inequality, police surveillance, and many other factors. But that is not the only reason that opposing abortion is racist. It also supports the deeply dangerous white replacement theory. White evangelicals believe that they are literally being replaced by people of other races, and that they need more white babies to be born. And this ideology goes hand in hand with the Quiverful movement, white Christian opposition to birth control in order to outbreed other racial and religious groups. Some people say that it is not opposing abortion that is racist, it is abortion itself. But here's Dr. Butler again, explaining how this is not true.
Dr. Butler, in his opinion, Justice Alito, in this draft opinion that's leaked, he writes in a footnote, quote, "It is beyond dispute that Roe has had that demographic effect. A highly disproportionate percentage of aborted fetuses are Black," end quote. Dr. Butler, it's long been a talking point on the anti-abortion right that abortion is racist. It's a tool to reduce the Black population. Yet there's no acknowledgement that Black American women are more likely to die in childbirth, less likely to have access to maternal health care. No mention that eliminating abortion access disproportionately impacts women of color. What is your reaction when you see Justice Alito pushing that talking point in his draft opinion?
Well, I have to say, I'm not surprised, because basically that has been the talking line, not just for people like Justice Alito, but actually for Black pro-life activists as well. I'm thinking about people like Alveda King here, who have said this the whole time. There's been a whole campaign against Black abortions. And the talking points go back in history all the way back to the beginning of Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger, and all of these things have been put together in a noxious stew, actually, about how this disproportionately affects Black women who go to have abortions, when in reality, all the things that you've just said, all of the maternal concerns, all of the money issues, everything else, have worked against African American women, and they don't even want to take care of Black women when they are having babies and want to have babies. So this is one of these kinds of things that I say is disingenuous, and also hides the racism that is behind these kinds of sentiments that Alito put forth in the document.
Yeah.
Before I begin reading the anti-abortion paper that I wrote in 9th grade, I have to show you the cover. When I found this recently in some old homeschooling stuff, it was really jarring to see, because I instantly recognized the white supremacist ideology in both the title and the artwork. I called the paper Saving Our Future. And my first question in the present is, whose future? And the artwork that I chose seems to answer that question. It is a very white child with blonde hair. I can't remember what gave me the idea for that title, but I'm fairly certain that when I chose the artwork, I wasn't thinking about race. But that is actually a big part of the problem. I was raised in what Dr. Butler calls the colorblind gospel, which makes white evangelicals the default. This is from page 58 of White Evangelical Racism. While abortion is commonly understood as the issue that began to unite evangelicals in the 1970s, I give that dubious honor to the issue of race. Race hatred played the fundamental role in, first, pushing evangelicals toward a colorblind gospel, which would provide cover for their racially motivated organizing against the federal government, and second, their push to block implementation of the hard-won gains of the civil rights movement. This colorblind gospel is how evangelicals used biblical scripture to affirm that everyone, no matter what race, is equal, and that race does not matter. The reality of the term colorblind, however, was more about making Black and other ethnic evangelicals conform to whiteness and accept white leadership as the norm, both religiously and socially. It is the equivalent of today's oft-quoted phrase, "I don't see color." Saying that means white is the default color. So when I was creating this cover, I probably searched for clip art child, chose one of the first results, and thought nothing of it. But again, that lack of thought reveals the unconscious racism that was already deeply ingrained in me. I thought that a white child could represent all children. And when I said saving our future, I didn't just mean babies being born in order to just live. Every single one of those babies could potentially grow up to become Christians, and that is what I believed was the purpose for life. The main source that I used throughout my paper was a book called Why Pro-Life by Randy Alcorn. Here is a video of him talking about his book.
My book, Why Pro-Life? People have asked, who's it for, really? Is it to persuade people who are pro-choice to help them become pro-life? And the answer is yes, it does exist for that purpose. Is it for believers, not only believers, but people who are already pro-life? Yes, it's for them too. What's in the book? I'm glad you asked that question. Chapter 1, why talk about abortion? And then I've got chapters about pro-woman or pro-child. And the answer is we should be pro-woman and pro-child. Is abortion right when pregnancy presents risks to the mother's life? Is abortion right when pregnancy is due to rape or incest? There's a huge issue, and that's one where a lot of Christians are not thinking accurately about this issue, and we really deal with that in that chapter. Does abortion prevent child abuse? Some surprising answers to that. Well, number one, that abortion is the ultimate child abuse because it's taking the life of a child actually in a very violent way. But even apart from that, does it prevent child abuse on some large scale, or in fact, does it contribute to the mentality that people look at born children and they say, well, I had the right to take their life before they were born. What's the big deal if I beat them up once they are born? Now, nobody says it that way, but that's part of how we view children is very much affected by this issue of abortion. Pro-life issues, distraction from the Great Commission or part of the Great Commission? You hear a lot of people say, oh, abortion has nothing to do with the gospel. Abortion has nothing to do with the church. The church should stay out of it because it's a political issue. You know what? It's not a political, yeah, sure, of course it's a political issue, but at its basis, at its foundation, it is a biblical issue, it is a moral issue. How do we view children? And does every human being have the right to live? And then finally, how can I help unborn babies and their mothers? And end with that. Say, there are things that all of us can do. It's not just that we have to be people who protest at abortion clinics or people who volunteer at crisis pregnancy centers or people who send our money to crisis pregnancy centers or to Right to Life or people who write letters to the editor. All of those things are great. But you know what? Every single one of us can talk to the person next door. Every one of us in our personal conversation can do what Scripture says. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves.
I included a list of links in the back, and since we didn't have the internet at home, I either looked these up at the library or at my grandparents' house. Most of these links are from two websites. one called Capitalism Magazine. I think that title speaks for itself. And the other is called Leadership U. Here is what the Leadership U archive page says. LeaderU.com was started in 1995 and became a hosting site for several apologetics and worldview websites. Today, there are many excellent high-quality apologetics ministries with excellent resource sites. And it suggests Veritas Forum, Josh McDowell, and Lee Strobel. So basically, it's just a whole list of Christian nationalist propaganda. And it says bibliography, but I had no idea how to properly cite sources. I was never taught in homeschooling how to write an academic paper. I had to learn that from scratch once I got to college. This entire thing is truly awful in every way. It is messy, incoherent at times, and intellectually dishonest. But I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's important to expose what I was being taught. By the way, this teacher who was marking up my paper was not a real teacher. This was not a real school. It was not accredited. I went there 2 times a week, and it was basically just a glorified co-op. A co-op in homeschooling is where a group of homeschool families all get together and different parents teach different subjects. They called themselves an academy, and they were deeply, deeply Christian nationalist. None of this is my own thoughts or logic. And that's how it was supposed to be. We were meant to internalize our indoctrination and then spread it to the rest of the world. Okay. Around the world, millions of lives are being taken. Sometimes, when women become pregnant, whether through consensual relations or not, they struggle with the decision to carry their baby to full term. Possibly, they are even raped or abused. Feeling confused, worthless, and unwanted, they go to counselors for help. Many times, Satan deceives them. Without weighing the consequences of their actions, these deluded mothers become an accessory to the murder of their own son or daughter. Their baby's life is ended when it was once protected and carried close inside of them. Abortion is a terrible disease that plagues the soul of our country. This is supposed to be a high school level academic paper. And I'm referring to Satan. Various doctors claim the embryos inside of these poor, involuntary mothers are just clumps of cells and are not real people. Okay, a couple of things right off the bat here. Who are these various doctors? We'll never know because I didn't specify. And now I'm calling people who may get an abortion poor, involuntary mothers, when a couple of sentences earlier I called them deluded mothers who were an accessory to the murder of their child. They state the baby is a foreign growth inside of the woman's body, and she has the right to choose what she wants to do with it. Moreover, wow, I'm surprised I even knew the word moreover. Moreover, they profess that these little children do not have the right to life. Oh, God, so many catchphrases there. Right to choose versus right to life. A child cannot acquire any rights until it is born, says Ayn Rand. By his own statement, Rand unwittingly affirms the existence of a child in the womb. And the teacher said, Ayn Rand is female, with a smiley face. You should say who she is, the founder of objectivism. I had no idea who Ayn Rand is, even though I included her in this paper. And to be honest, I had to look her up in preparation for this video because I still didn't know. But according to Google, she was a Russian-American writer who was born in 1905 and is most well known for her philosophy of objectivism. Apparently, she also believed in access to abortion, which is why she is in this paper. But I have no idea where I got the quote from because I didn't cite it. Christian nationalist homeschooling does not care about citing the sources of their opponents. They believe that they have the one right truth, so why would they care about someone else's beliefs or viewpoint? At least the teacher also had the decency to ask, where is this from? We must ask ourselves, if we do not protect the rights of these defenseless little ones, who will? Ayn Rand goes on to say, I cannot project the degree of hatred required to make these women run around in crusades against abortion. Hatred is what they certainly project, not love for the embryos, which is a piece of nonsense no one could experience. Their hatred is directed against human beings as such, against the mind, against reason, against ambition, against success, against love, against any value that brings happiness to life. And again, who knows what the context is for that quote, because I didn't include it. We must again ask the question, how can a society allow the murder of its future? Countless abortionists openly attack anyone who is pro-life, saying they are motivated by hate. There's that persecution complex. In an abortionist article online, it was crudely stated, anti-abortionists are not lovers of life, lovers of tissue maybe, but their stand marks them haters of real human beings. Italics added. Is not murder the ultimate demonstration of hatred? And the teacher underlined that and put a little smiley face. A particular online author's view on abortion specifically attacked Christians, accusing them of not reading their Bibles. Which online author? Nobody knows, nobody cares apparently. Personally, I'd love to read it now, because I feel like it might have some good points. He gave several poor arguments and examples from God's Word, attempting to show how God supports abortion. By the way, I capitalized God's Word. I capitalized the W in word, which one could argue is a little bit idolatrous, is it not? Using Psalm 139, 13 through 16, which addresses God's working within the womb, this man said, while God was involved in the creation of this human being, it does not state that during the creation the fetus was indeed a person. Unbelievably, he also attempted to say God was promoting a written form of pornography, if one takes Song of Solomon literally. Again, I think that's a valid point. It probably was pretty pornographic for its time and context. He further proposes one must take the Bible in its context and not take it literally. Oh God, that's really telling. I was saying that as if it was so preposterous that we should take the Bible in its context and not take it literally. I mean, I was a fundamentalist through and through. The Bible is our rule book and we take it literally. Yikes. His failed attempt at hermeneutics used Exodus 21, 22 through 25 to claim if a pregnant woman is struck and only the baby is hurt, the offender will pay as the judge decides. This text speaks of premature birth and not necessarily the death or injury of the baby. He goes on to say, again, incorrectly applying the art and science of biblical interpretation. Because I, as a 14-year-old, am such a scholar. That part I just added. If the woman also is killed, then he is to be repaid with a life for a life. The verse in question may well be addressing the death of the baby and not the mother. His bias impels him to form a false conclusion. Abortion is biblical. And the teacher put a winking smiley face next to the sentence, if the woman also is killed, then he is to be repaid with a life for a life. Why are we winking about death? God has a purpose for each individual. I think I meant to say purpose, but I said propose. God has a purpose for each individual, and they may enjoy God's perfect plan if he is allowed to work in their lives. Every human being begins as a fetus. Randy Alcorn argues that saying a fetus is not fully human because it is at an earlier stage of development is like saying a cute little toddler is not a person because it has not yet reached maturity. That is not the same thing. That is not the same thing. God longs to have a love relationship with every human being and has predestined each one to love and be loved before they were born. When a fetus is killed, this bond cannot be fulfilled on earth. And that's another example of what I was saying earlier. The purpose of opposing abortion, in my mind as a teenager, was not just to avoid murder, but also to create a whole bunch of Christians. It was the culture wars. We were taking over the country and eventually the world for Jesus. Life is life. Wow, what a profound statement. Life is life. At conception, a life has begun. A human being has unique DNA, half of the information from its father and half from its mother. All of this complex information makes a very tiny, yet complete human being. A former genetics professor at the University of Descartes in Paris said, "After fertilization has taken place, a new human being has come into being." The fact of human life beginning at conception was so clear that a bill was approved by the Missouri General Assembly in 2003, which declared, "The General Assembly of this state finds that, number 1, the life of each human being begins at conception. Number 2, unborn children have protectable interests in life, health, and well-being. The term unborn children or unborn child shall include all unborn children or the offspring of human beings from the moment of conception until birth at every stage of biological development." Now, it's really important to point out here that I was raised to be pretty anti-government because I was taught that the government was always imposing these anti-Christian and anti-homeschooling laws on us. So this is an example of that intellectual dishonesty. It was okay to quote the Missouri General Assembly because it aligned with my beliefs and the beliefs of my community. Abortion is murder. It kills innocent, powerless, unique lives that would have grown up to be people with distinct personalities. Sometimes the mother loses all hope and the chance for happiness in this life when she finally realizes she has unwittingly allowed the murder of her own child. A mother's guilt associated with the complicit termination of her baby often cause PAS, post-abortion syndrome, a prolonged depression. Now, full disclosure, I did not do a lot of research on this supposed post-abortion syndrome, so I don't know if that is an official term or not, because again, I did not cite my source. But again, this is very telling, because I wasn't brought up to care about mental health issues. I was taught that things like depression were the attacks of Satan. So the only reason that that is mentioned is to support this propaganda. I really don't want to read the next sentence, but I think that I should. So, content warning for anti-Semitism. I will put the time code on the screen. You may skip this next part if you'd like. I said, this Holocaust must be stopped. It is very insensitive, problematic, and just plain wrong to compare abortion to the Holocaust. But unfortunately, that was and continues to be a very common comparison amongst conservatives, evangelicals, and fundamentalists. Continuing with the last two sentences. America must stand up for these babies who have been fearfully and wonderfully made. When they are allowed the opportunity to grow up to be who God intended them to be, our land will be healed. And that last sentence really ties it all together with a Christian nationalist bow. Our land will be healed. And then the teacher wrote, "This is the best essay I've read so far. Excellent reasoning, calm opinion, and good fact. 47 out of 50. If this was the best essay she read, that really shows you how terrible my education was. It wasn't an education, it was an indoctrination. I am definitely not the first person to say this, but white evangelicals are not pro-life. They are simply pro-forced birth." I would like to end this video with more insightful words from Dr. Anthea Butler.
We have ignored what has happened throughout all this time. You have ignored the fact that evangelicals from the inception of Roe forward have had very big lobbying organizations like Focus on the Family and others, Family Research Council, that have come together. This is a very strong network. One of the things I think people don't even realize is that it's not just about Supreme Court justices. It's about the over 200 justices and judges throughout America that were appointed during the Trump administration. And so while people had sort of scoffed about, the religious right, evangelicals, however you want to term them, what they have done is organize very well. The money is strong and powerful. That is second. And third, you all are playing catch up. And that is the problem here, is that the networks that have been formed on the left or for liberals or for even moderates who believe in this need to start to think about how to come together to shore up these systems, to shore up our democracy, because our democracy is in peril. And I don't think that people really understand how much that is the case these days between this potential Supreme Court ruling, 1-6, everything else. All of these things are the set piece that are happening.
I hope people are starting to understand it if they don't already. We thank you for the work that you've done and for being with us this morning. Anthea Butler is the chair of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the author of White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America.
Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.